Container controls are meant for grouping other controls. For example, there's a group box control, which is really just a box with a title, a panel, which provides a scrollable region, a split container, which is two panel controls with a splitter between them. There's a tab control, which provides one or more tab pages, the flow layout panel, in which controls are laid out like HTML with a flow layout, and a table layout panel, which allows dynamic layout using a table. We'll look at each of those in this section and the next. Should you use a panel or a group box? The panel allows you to add scroll bars, and it creates a scrolling region. The panel supports changing the border style. On the other hand, the group box has a title. It doesn't do any of the other things, but it does support a title on the box. Of course, you might wonder, why would you even use a container? You might want to have multiple sets of radio buttons. A form acts as a container, so radio buttons have unique values. But if you need more than one set, you can't put them all on the same form because they'd all work together. You would need a container to provide a separate group of radio buttons. Or if you want to treat a group of controls as a single entity, perhaps to enable or disable the entire group or show and hide the entire group. Or perhaps you want to manage the layout of the controls. A split panel handles this. The tab control allows you to have individual groups of controls, and the flow layout panel and table layout panel, each of these controls support complex layouts. For the most part, working with container controls is just like working with any other control, except that they contain other controls. On the other hand, moving the controls can be difficult. You'll want to watch for the moving handle, which looks like a little crosshair in the upper left-hand corner of the control. Grab that moving handle in order to move a container control that's full of other controls. Let's start by investigating how we've created the main switchboard form for this application. I've loaded the sample project for this section named Container Controls and have loaded the switchboard form in Design View. On this form, I have an image list control, which contains images that I've bound to the various buttons on the form. The image list control allows me to choose images for display. If I look at the images, I just took screenshots of the various controls and placed them into this image list. Here are all the control images I stored away, and then for each one of these controls, if I bring up the Properties window, you'll see the image key. That's the key associated with each image in the image list, and a property, which is the image list property, tells me where to get the images from. So for each button, I'm pulling an image from this image list control that contains all of the images that I display on this form. Now, why did we set the form up this way? Mostly just because we could, and it also gave me an example to demonstrate the image list control, which we don't show off anywhere else in this course. We'll start our tour by looking at the group box control. This control provides a convenient way to group other controls so that you can, for example, have grouping for radio button controls, make it easy to move or copy groups of controls at runtime or design time, and make it easy to show or hide or enable or disable a group of controls as a clump. It also makes it easy to set a font for a group of controls because the controls in the group box can inherit their font from the group box control. If you don't want a border around your group, you should use the panel control instead. The panel control doesn't provide a title, but it also makes it much easier to set the border for the group. One thing to note about group boxes before we investigate the demonstration is that radio button controls allow only one item to be selected from a group. That's the behavior of radio button. And each different container provides a different group. The form acts as a container, and a group box acts as a container. You can use multiple container controls to provide multiple groups. We'll see this on our sample form. I've loaded the sample project and clicked the Group Box button to display our Group Box form here. On the bottom part of this, there's a panel, and we have on here two group box controls, Group 1 and Group 2, each of which contain multiple radio buttons. You can see that each group works independently because we have two separate group box controls. The group box has a text property. Here we have another group up here, and I can change the text property by changing the value in this text box. You can see that as we type in the text changed event, we're setting the text property of the group box at the top of this form. There's also a dock property of a group box control, and it does pretty much what you'd expect. Right now, we're not docking at all. We can dock to the top, to the bottom. There's dock to the bottom of the form. We can dock it to the left, which is not going to be attractive. And of course, now we've lost our controls here. So I think I'll start over again. There we go. We can dock in any number of places on this form. We can dock to fill as well, and it fills all the available space. Well, because this group box control actually is sitting behind this panel, the group box right now fills the entire form. For now, I'll dock it to the top of the form, and there we go. The group box also supports auto size properties. The auto size property controls if the control automatically resizes itself based on its contents. The default value is true, and the auto size mode property controls how this works. We can both grow and shrink based on the contents, or grow only. So here, let's turn auto size on and choose here, say, grow and shrink. We should now see that the group box has shrunk to match the size because it's docked on the form. But to test auto size, we need the dock to be off altogether. We can't see it if we're docking, because when it's docked, it's filling all the available space. If we turn dock off, if we set auto size mode to grow and shrink, we'll see that it shrinks to fit the space it needs. If we set it to grow only, let's set it back to top here, and now turn this off, you can see that it doesn't really shrink to fit the space it needs. It'll only grow if we need to resize or change controls within it. Let's dock it again. There's also a background image and a back color property. Let's display a background image, and you can see that we can display an image behind the controls within the group box. All we're doing here is setting the background image property to be one of the resources coming from this project's resource file. Let's turn that off and display a background color instead. Now I've set the back color property to be Honeydew, a color that specifies the back color property for that group box. We can also control the visible and enabled property. If we make the control invisible, all the controls within the group box disappear. If we disable the group box, all the controls within it become disabled. This is a great way to control groups of controls with just one property setting, to enable or disable, to hide or show entire groups of controls. We can also change the font of the group box. Let's change it to, say, Verdana 12. And then all the controls within the group box change their font. I'll put it back the way it was, and it's just one line of code. It sets the demo group box font to be the dialog box's font, and one line of code changes the behavior of all the controls within that group box. As you'll see, most of the properties we've investigated here apply to other container controls as well. The panel control is much like the group box, except that it doesn't have a title, it allows you to remove the border, and it can display scroll bars automatically. If you set the auto scroll property to true, things just take care of themselves as you resize the panel control. Let's look at an example that demonstrates the behavior of the panel control. I've loaded the panel control demonstration form, and you can see the panel at the top of this form. We can set the border style for this control to be none, fixed single, or fixed 3D None, of course, hides it. Fix single you've seen already, and fix 3D allows us to have an indented panel. If you need a group of controls without a border, your best bet is to use the panel control with its border style set to none. The panel control supports some scrolling features, so we need to test those here. And here's how we're going to do it. I'm going to set the dock property to dock at the top. There we go. I'll select the auto scroll checkbox, and I'll set the auto scroll margin to 25. I picked an arbitrary value here. You'll see how this works in a moment. The auto scroll margin property is actually a size structure with a width and a height. In this example, I'm using the same value for the width. The auto scroll margin property is actually a size structure with width and height properties. In this example, we're using a single value for both width and height. So the auto scroll margin.width and auto scroll margin.height are both set to 25 here. You can make different values in your code. Just to keep this simple, I use the same value for both. Now let me make the form smaller slowly. Now watch what happens as we get to the point where I need scroll bars. Suddenly, the scroll bars appear. What happens is when we get within 25 pixels of the edge, it knows it needs to add scroll bars. So I have to do very carefully here. There we go. We got within 25 pixels of a place where we would need to scroll, so it added scroll bars for us. Besides the scrolling capabilities and the ability to remove the border and the fact that it doesn't have a title, the panel control is almost identical to the group box control. This form allows you to investigate other properties, but they're pretty much the same as the same properties for the group box control. The split container control is really just a container for two panel controls and a splitter. It can be horizontal or vertical, and you can move the splitter at design time or at runtime. There is a retired splitter control from earlier versions of Visual Studio, and it's still available, but really you won't use it. The split container control is so much easier to work with. The split container control is useful for creating Explorer-like interfaces where you need two panels that can each be resized. Let's look at a demonstration that points out this behavior. This sample form contains a split container control. On the left-hand side, we're seeing a list of drives on the computer. On the right-hand side, we're seeing a list of files on that selected drive in a list view control. Now there's a number of things we can do to show off the behavior of this. First of all, notice the splitter here can be moved to the left or to the right. And as I move it, you see the splitter distance changes. I can programmatically change the splitter distance as well. And the same with the splitter width. I can control how wide that splitter is on my form. 11's probably too wide, and 1 is a little narrow, but you'll find the one that works for you. The orientation property controls how the split works. It's either horizontal or vertical. If we make it horizontal, we have split this horizontally, and there are our two panels. If we make it vertical, there we are back again. You can set a fixed panel. The fixed panel property allows you to fix the width of one of the two panels. Only one of them can be fixed, obviously. The property can accept a value from the fixed panel enumeration, and it can be none, panel 1, or panel 2. Panel 1 is on the left or top, panel 2 is on the right or bottom. Let's make the panel 1 fixed, and now as I resize the form, you'll see that panel 1 doesn't change its size. If we set this to none, if I resize the form, then you see the panels maintain their proportional sizes. If I make panel 2 fixed and then resize the form, we see that panel 1 changes its size. You can make the splitter be fixed, so it can't be moved. Now I can't move the splitter. That's the isSplitterFixed property. It's a Boolean, set it to yes or no, true or false, and it controls whether or not the splitter can be fixed. The splitter distance property, as you've seen, allows you to control how far from the left or from the top the splitter is. The panel 1 min size and panel 2 min size properties control the minimum size for each panel. Right now they're each set to 25, so the narrowest I can make one of these panels is 25 pixels. That's not quite right. That seems a little too narrow for me. So let's make panel 1 min size be 100 or so. There we go. And now the minimum I can make that is 100 pixels. Seems like a better size. You can also make panel 1 or panel 2 be collapsed, but not both. If I collapse panel 1, it's gone. If I collapse panel 2, panel 1 is gone. Only one of those can be collapsed at a time. Now, I didn't make these radio buttons here because of the way this property is implemented. If panel 1 is already collapsed and you attempt to make panel 2 collapsed, the last one wins. It's not like only one of these can be true. They can both be true. Just the last one you set takes precedence. So I'll uncheck them both, and there we go. There are several events that occur in the split container. There's a splitter moving event, which occurs as the splitter bar is in the process of moving. If you need to do something while the bar is moving, you can react to that event. You can also react to the splitter moved event, which is what I'm doing here. When the splitter moved event occurs, the user has released the mouse. And at that point, I update the splitter distance here. There's a little bit of complexity to the code because it depends on the orientation here. Think about it a second. If the split is horizontal, what we care about here is the y-coordinate of the current location of the splitter. If it's vertical, however, what we care about is the x-coordinate of the splitter. So the code which fills in this value has a little bit of logic that checks the orientation, and based on the orientation either retrieves the x or the y coordinate of the current location of the splitter. You'll find the splitter control very useful if you need to display two panels of information and you want to be able to dynamically change the split between the two. The tab control should be pretty clear what this control does. It's a container for tab page controls, and each tab page is a container for other controls. You can use the tab control to create multi-page dialog boxes like those used by Windows, or you can just lay out multiple pages of controls to consolidate controls and allow many controls on the page that you wouldn't be able to fit without the tab control. Let's start out by laying out the tab control manually to see how it works. Then we'll look at an example of a pre-created form to show off some of the features of the tab control. I've loaded the sample form, test form, from our project, and we'll play with the tab control on this form. Let's go to our toolbox, and from the Containers section, there we are, let's drag a tab control onto the form. Let's move it onto the form, actually. And here on the task pane, you'll see options to add tab and remove tab. If we want to set other properties, we'll need to go to the Properties window. I'll go to the Properties window, and here for our tab control, I'll set the dock property to fill the entire form. If we click the two existing tabs, you'll see we flip back and forth between the two tabs on the tab control. Now, it can be tricky getting used to selection within the tab control. If I select here within a page, I've selected that particular page. If I want to go to tab page 2, I select here and then select within the page. If I want to select the entire control, the easiest way to do it is to click up here outside any of the tab pages, and now I've selected the entire tab control again. Let's go back to the first tab page, and from the toolbox, let's put a button control on the page. On the second tab page, let's put a text box control. If we flip back and forth, it should be pretty clear what's going on here. Now I can select the tab control and from the Task pane, select Add Tab. I have now a third tab, and on the third tab, I'll add a button control too, just so we can differentiate each of the pages. Here's 2, 1, 2, and 3. Let's click within Tab Page 3, go to the Properties window, and set the text to be, there we go. So you can change the text of the tab within the Properties window here. Let's select the Tab control once again and look at the Tab Pages property of the Tab control. If I click the button, it brings up the Tab Page Collection Editor with information about each of the tab pages. This is a great way to work with the tab pages. You can, for example, move them to a different location. You can flip through them all and set a single property for each of them one at a time. Makes it easier to work with the tab pages this way. You can add a tab page or remove a tab page, or you can set any of the properties of the tab page here. We've now moved the third tab to the first position. Well, we've seen a few of the issues involved in working with the tab control and designing it yourself. For now, let's clean this up by removing the tab control, closing the test form, and we'll look now at the pre-created sample form. I'll press F5 to run our sample project, and I'll choose the Tab Control button, which brings up a form that allows us to work with various properties of the tab control. Let's start by looking at the alignment property. This controls where the tabs show up. They can be at the top, bottom, left, or right, and notice how the text rotates if we choose left or right. You'll most often have the tabs at the top, but you can play with other alignments if you like. The appearance property allows you to control how the tabs appear within the tab control. The appearance can be normal, flat buttons, or buttons. Let's try various appearances. Buttons have just buttons there, flat buttons, and the combination of appearance and alignment controls some of the behavior as well. For example, if I put the controls on the left, you can't use flat buttons. It doesn't work that way. If you ask for flat buttons, you get normal buttons. I can choose normal or buttons, but I can't get flat buttons if I put the alignment to be left or right. I would suggest you really leave the buttons at the top unless you have a really good reason for moving them somewhere else. The multi-line property allows you to get or set a value indicating whether the tab control displays its tabs on more than one line. If you add more tabs that can fit on one line, and the multi-line property is false, you get arrows that allow you to navigate. If it's true, you see the tabs on more than one line. Let me add a bunch of tabs. There we go. And the multi-line property is true right now. If I set it to false, we get arrows that allow us to navigate through the various tabs. The size mode property allows you to control how the tab control sizes its tabs. You have options here. We can use normal, fill to right, or fixed. Let's try some various settings here. I'll choose multi-line to be true again, and set size mode to be fill to right, and then the tabs stretch out to fill the space available to them. If I choose fixed, then the tabs are all exactly the same size. The fill to right value only has an effect if the multi-line property is also set to true. Otherwise, it's the same as selecting normal. It really can't do anything unless the multi-line property has been set to true. The Show Tooltips property controls whether a tab's tooltip value is shown when the mouse passes over the tab. Unlike most other controls, the tab control manages its own tooltips. You don't need to add a tooltip control to the form in order to use tooltips with the tab control. Now, the code on this form has set up tooltips so that as I hover over each tab, there's text that shows me which tab I'm hovering over. This is done programmatically, and all the code is doing is looping through each page, each tab page in the tab pages collection, and for each one, we set the tooltip to be the page you're on with the text you're hovering on. We can turn off tooltips, and then those things don't show up anymore. There are some informational properties in a tab control as well. You can find out the row count, and that changes, of course, if I resize the form. Let's see if I can turn this off back on again. The row count gets set to 3. I only change that value when I set certain properties. Tab count tells you how many tabs there are. Selected index tells you which tab is currently selected. Right now it's 2. And the selected tab.text property, I'm just displaying this. You can see that the selected tab will give you information about the currently selected tab, and we can retrieve the text property of that. To add a new tab is quite simple. The code simply calls the add method of the tab pages collection. Nothing more than that. There are a few events of the tab control that you might care about. There's a selected event and a deselected event. So when it becomes selected or deselected, each tab raises those events. There's a selecting and deselecting event, which occurs before you select it, well, as you're selecting it, before it becomes selected. And deselecting, well, that occurs as you're moving off of a tab before it becomes deselected. And finally, there's a selected index changed event that occurs when the selected index property changes, either in code or when the user selects a new tab. You're likely to use this event most often, and that's what the code is doing here to set this value. When I move from one tab to another, I'm trapping the selected index changed event to update this label control. Spend some time playing with the tab control. It's got a lot of features that you may find useful in your applications. You can add new pages dynamically, for example, as you encounter more data in your application as well. The control raises enough events so you can interact with it in a very rich sort of way, and you can always know what the user has just done with the tab control.